the tag on in between mood music and stuff. So I enjoy it.
Thanks, McKay. And for anyone who's in my session, remember I said about, speculative futures opening the genre to wider range of voices. Just look at all these women. Yes. Nice to see. My name is Lee Murray. For those of you who don't know me, I'm an award-winning author and editor of speculative fiction, science fiction, fantasy, horror. And I'm delighted to introduce this absolutely star-studded panel of guests to talk on this panel with you today. So I'm going to kind of read, I don't want to miss anything good. So I'm going to read out their, I'm going to read out their bios. So bear with me, I'm sorry. But these bios don't really tell you how amazing these women are and what incredible stuff they're writing. It's like, oh, I do a few things, and it just, they've given me these bios and I do a few things, and it just doesn't reflect at all the quality of their work and the breadth of their work. So look them up afterwards. Some of you will have been to Octavia's talk earlier. She has a PhD in science communication and likes using science fiction and fantasy to talk about science in new and interesting ways. That is certainly true from her writing. For example, her climate fiction novel, The Stonewetter, out earlier this year from Paper Road Press, Marie over here, allowed her to plunder her folder of weird plants and animals, ask her about the fish scale gecko of Madagascar if you want to be particularly revolted. Mostly she writes short stories though. She spent nearly the entirety of lockdown as writer-in-residence at the Square Edge Arts Centre in Palmerston North. Go Palmerston North! And after the festival, she's heading down to the Christchurch Arts Centre to be resident there for another 6 weeks. Fantastic. She's planning to write about Ernest Rutherford, and the Arts Centre contains the recreation of this laboratory, and she can't wait to explore. Can you write about Ernest Rutherford and something else? Yeah, the Heart of the Matter. I love that story. Love that story.
You can find the book over on the table.
So our superstar, fantastic. So definitely look up Octavia's work if you haven't already read it, because it's amazing. Melanie Hardingshaw, she calls herself a newbie, but she's kind of, straight out of the gate and into the awards list. So well done, Melanie. She's won her first Julius Vocal Award this year. Congratulations. So she's a speculative. Oh no, that wasn't the bio of your read. Right, so it's her fault. She sent it to me after I'd left. No. Melanie Hardingshaw is a speculative fiction writer and policy geek. Her stories range across the fantasy, science fiction and horror spectrum and have appeared in a number of local and international publications, including the year's best Aotearoa New Zealand science fiction and fantasy. Again, thank you, Marie. And best of British fantasy anthologies, and I didn't know that. She was the New Zealand Writer Liaison for Con New Zealand, the 78th World Science Fiction Convention, hosted virtually by Wellington this year, and she won the 2020 Sir Julius Vogel Award for services to science fiction, fantasy, and horror. And she writes, gosh, I hate writing about myself, lol. Well, isn't that true? But yes, a rising star. So, and I think I'm just about to publish a little piece of flash fiction by Melanie in Midnight Echo, which is the Australian Horror Writers Association annual magazine, which I was guest editor of this year. God, so much good writing. Laura Jean McKay is new to me. Welcome to New Zealand, Laura. She's the author of Animals in That Country, Scribe 2020, so it's just recent. Did any of who went to Laura's talk this morning, which I missed? Oh, was it good? I'm sure it was. And Holiday in Cambodia, which was published by Black Ink in 2013. So a bit of time between stories. And that was shortlisted for 3 National Book Awards in Australia. Her work appears in, I can't pronounce this, Meanjin, Overland, Best Australian Stories. Oh, I don't know Meanjin, I need to look that up. The Saturday Paper and the North American Review. I'm really making a mess of these bios, aren't I? Laura is a lecturer in creative writing at Massey University with a PhD from the University of Melbourne, focusing on literary animal studies. She is the animal expert presenter on ABC's Listen's Animal Sounds Safari, which is why she's more photogenic than me. And Cassie Hart, yeah, one of my favourite writers in New Zealand. She writes at JC Hart and Nova Blake, and she's a speculative fiction writer who enjoys delving into human nature in all its beauty and disarray. Over the past 5 years, she has published over 10 novels and novellas. Yeah, she has, and has had her work printed in various anthologies, including Foreign Country. Yay, Andy! Baby Teeth, Bite-Sized Tales of Terror. Yes. Cthulhu, Land of the Long White Cloud, and Regeneration. Again, Andy, thank you. As well as co-editing and contributing to the Sir Julius Vogel Award-winning benefit anthology Tales for Canterbury. Oh yeah, I remember when the rule went up and that was one. That was fantastic. That was after the earthquake, wasn't it? That was amazing. In 2018, she was selected as one of 6 emerging Maori writers to participate in Te Papa Tupu Incubator Program, where she worked on her novel Butcherbird, a supernatural suspense set under the watchful gaze of Mount Taranaki. She lives with her husband and 3 daughters, 2 of whom she homeschools in New Zealand.
Butcherbird is coming out next year.
Yay! Yay! Congratulations. So, yes. Wow. So, yeah, if there's something to know about speculative fiction, these ladies will know it. So, first question. Ha 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 ha. You can imagine what this question is. What does speculative fiction mean to you? A definition. Please, who would like to begin?
I like to think of it as an umbrella term for kind of science fiction, fantasy, horror, but also everything in the middle of those.
Oh, that sounds like a meta-generic, what was that thing?
Fuzzy,
Super fuzzy genre.
Yeah, it kind of is. It can be anything. Yeah, really. Yeah, but I think it does, especially when science fiction or fantasy don't quite fit a thing. That's usually speculative fiction, somewhere in the mix of them, the combination. Yeah.
It's like anything where the world isn't quite as you know it, and it can be really small difference, like in near future sci-fi, like just 3 years ahead technology thing, where it can be aliens on another planet or high fantasy or whatever.
Or possessions or
Monsters,
ghosts or
tentacles.
tentacles. Yeah.
Octavia? Do you have anything to add to tentacles?
Yeah, I think it's a way to explore reality in non-realistic ways. I mean, it doesn't constrict you, I think, to things that absolutely could happen. And it's a way, I think, especially with science fiction, to almost future-proof the way society is going. You know, we can explore all the what-ifs. What if we do this? What if government does this? What if scientists explore this? How will it affect us? And it's much more accessible that way than, you know, a lot of policy stuff which is buried in archives somewhere.
Yeah. Laura?
I think, I don't know if this is a definition, but I think I love it because, you know, we can all be sitting here in our real world and suddenly, you know, a large blue whale can you know, crash through the ceiling and then breach over our heads. So it's sort of, it takes the elements of gritty realist fiction to me and adds this genre and otherworldly element that often speaks to the things that we can't quite say in the real world, or the things that we're trying to get at but can't quite reach.
And sometimes it just gives you Sharknado.
That's like 2 hours of your life you can't get back, right?
Somebody you watching.
You know, I think that it took me 40 minutes to get to the definition of speculative fiction in my talk. So these ladies just like did it in like a minute, you know. So does anyone else want to add in any other ideas that they have about speculative fiction? Because this I think part it really is hard to define, isn't it? I mean, nobody's given us the same exact definition. Does anyone else want to add any insight into what they think speculative fiction is? Anything else? Anything? Well, you know, just the fact that it's such a nebulous idea, do us a disservice because people can't really put their finger on it. Do you think that's true?
Well, I think sometimes that it varies on what we think non-realism is. I mean, Cassie was talking about possession, and I loved Exorcist films. I've written papers on them. But the thing with things like possession and ghosts is that for some cultures, these are not speculative.
Yeah.
So it is a genre that sort of changes. It's very dependent on the culture that you're coming from.
I think there's a really interesting intersection with like genre versus literary fiction as well. Like we had a panel earlier in the year on speculative fiction in Wellington, and there was a discussion about whether there was a difference between speculative fiction and literary fiction with speculative elements. But I don't know that I draw that distinction myself. Like I feel like when people are saying that, they're often talking about beautiful prose or meaningful themes or something, and I don't think that that's that just because something has those characteristics that it's not also speculative or genre fiction.
No one shoves magical realism in with the sci-fi section in the bookshops, do they? This is sort of the literary version.
It's also another good term where you can throw about if it's not quite, because some of like science fiction, space opera has a very kind of, you know what space opera is and you know what I can't think of it, zombie book is, but if you want to add other elements into it that aren't necessarily going to fit that mold of what defines that genre, then it's speculative fiction, which kind of means people know what it's kind of about, but also that it's not necessarily going to meet all of your expecteds of a specific definition of a different genre.
Would you agree, Leon?
I was just sort of thinking about what a speculative fiction writer is, because when we were discussing this panel, I felt that you all defined yourself perhaps as speculative fiction writers, but I've written a speculative fiction book, and I don't know when do you become a spec fic writer?
Right, speculative fiction.
You're a writer.
I think now. From now, yeah. Now.
So it's a very inclusive. It is a very inclusive term.
I think it is more inclusive than say, you know, like hard science fiction is not very inclusive of a lot of things that aren't that, but speculative fiction is because it embraces
it's like a family
so
of
much. Yeah,
similar.
yeah, it's like a bunch of cousins hanging out.
It's also
rather than
shorter.
just siblings.
Shorter. You say I write speculative fiction rather than I write science fiction, fantasy, horror.
And all those other things.
Yeah.
Paranormal.
Although it does tend to require more explanation to people about what speculative fiction is.
And we don't also see a shelf in the bookstore in the library that says speculative fiction. So maybe that's part of the problem, is that readers don't necessarily know what it is because it's not, you know, what is it? You know, there's no shelf for it. So that may be part of the problem, that, you know, people don't know what it is.
No, probably I think there's some famous authors that have like a slightly different take on the definition. I think Margaret Atwood does something funny with the definition of speculative fiction. I can't remember exactly what it is, but she definitely doesn't see it
I
as
can't
that.
remember it off the top of my head either, but I might have just quoted it.
She definitely doesn't see it as that all of those sci-fi and
Yeah, I think there's a lot of a lot of writers who try and distance themselves from this idea of speculative fiction because there's a perception that it's not real literature.
Genre.
Yeah, it's genre. It's not real literature, which is just not true. I've read these ladies' work. Well, I haven't read Laura's yet, but I'm looking forward to reading it. And you know, and they write beautiful prose. So just because something is speculative does not mean it is not also literary. And that, I think literary is a difficult one, isn't it? Because it means written words. It means wording. So I guess the question I wanted to ask perhaps Melanie first, because she calls herself emerging, which clearly is not true. But is you know, what sparked your love of the genre? What makes you decide to be? Why did you start out and say, I'm going to write speculative? How did you start? Why speculative? When you know the rest of us can tell you, choose something else. It'll be easier.
Well, I only started writing in 2016, so I think when I started, I just wanted to write something for my kids. I have three young kids, and so I went to what I loved as a child, and what I read as a kid was all fantasy and science fiction. It was Anne McCaffrey's Friendships and Tamora Pierce's high fantasy, and Romany Feist and Jenny Witt's like the big long series of epic fantasy and really immersive worlds, and that was what I loved to immerse myself in as a child. So I started out writing a middle grade high fantasy novel for my kids, and then I just kept going, and now I write everything.
Right, Laura, because you just described yourself as not a speculative fiction writer. So why did you start writing where you did, and how did you come to be, how did you come to be writing speculative? Has it just happened? Is it just an accident?
I think I was very interested in literary fiction and what I would call gritty realism, but living in the world over the last decade especially, I think it's really, really hard to not engage with these sort of horrific, serious outcomes in climate, in our relationship with other animals, with extinction events especially, and with the political landscape that we're facing. The world is changing so rapidly. So I think despite myself, I started writing speculatively just because I think it's a really important way to engage with these almost impossible ideas. And now that we're here, and I just released this novel which has pandemic elements, which was supposed to be a plot device, and suddenly very, very real, I feel as though speculative fiction is more realistic now than literary fiction, which is almost nostalgic.
Oh, that's interesting.
We
quote that. That is an amazing statement. I have to write that down and quote it everywhere.
I'm slow writing it down.
You feel like I've been reading, I was reading the Severance by, I can't remember who it's by, which is a pandemic novel, and taking pandemic advice from this, this very futuristic speculative fiction novel, and then reading a novel set in Melbourne and thinking, oh, how sweet. They're all getting together and hugging each other and having sex and things. And
So it doesn't. I mean, for me, it's climate change, the central issue of our time, and all these literary books that are talking about broken marriages and families falling apart. It's like, well, there's a bigger issue here. Can you stop, I mean, I know it means a lot to you, but if I want to read something, relevant and important these days, I tend to go to speculative fiction because they're the ones that are engaging with the larger issues. I'm not saying that, people's individual misery is unimportant. It's not something I care to read about.
Octavia Cade, literary fiction as individual misery. Oh dear. No, but that's very important, and I think that is also where the younger people are, isn't it? That's what they're reading, and so if we're talking about growing a new cohort of readers, then we need to be in the space where young people are, the topics that interest them.
Post-apocalyptic fiction is the juggernaut of the young adult reading world. And it's set in this sort of nebulous future, I think, where power relationships have become so unbalanced that people can no longer control their own lives. And this is, of course, a theme that really resonates with teenagers in general. But it's also a theme that interacts with, the increasingly unstable political elements that we are observing in some countries. And it does it in a speculative way. What happens to my life if I'm used as fodder for entertainment? What happens to my life if I'm categorized by this specific piece of my personality? And it's engaging with possible futures with young adults in a way that a lot of literary fiction just doesn't. And that, I think, is why young adults are so drawn to it, because they're being treated like people who think.
Well, perhaps too, because literary fiction is aimed at a different cohort of people. So, I mean, it's written for potentially that cohort of women readers, middle-aged women readers. Do you think?
A lot of the middle-aged women I know read speculative fiction.
Yeah, but we're in a different group, obviously. We walk in rarefied circles. Yeah. here. Cassie, why speculative fiction?
For me, I grew up on it. I grew up reading. My family, collective family, had a massive, I remember, like bookshelves on bookshelves of Terry Pratchett and all the Dune books and Melanie, all of those things. It's what I grew up on. And then my own reading was mostly horror, just lots of horror. And I don't know why, because no one else in my family reading this. But I really liked it, and I think it was just more interesting to me as a younger person to read possibilities rather than actualities. But as the others have mentioned, I think it's a really unique, you can approach truths, more universal, wider truths in speculative fiction in a way that can be a bit safer or a bit more honest than you can sometimes in like contemporary fiction, I think.
Yeah, I would say that's true. And we've had this discussion before about things like using horror to really delve into your fears and put it on the page. And I was talking about this earlier in my discussion about how, you know, it's a way of coping. And so even though we read it as escapism, it actually does allow us to address various issues that are really concerning us and work through them.
It's
Or at
an
least
exploration, especially as a writer, it's an exploration of topics and issues that can be quite painful or dangerous or traumatic or just challenging, and that helps readers to also think about those things in a way that's not immediately putting themselves in difficult positions.
And I think also if you put it on the page, right, if it's black and white and it's on the page in words, it's less scary. It's distance.
There is that distance, that element of safety, even when it doesn't feel always safe.
I think too, with the advent of social media, there is a way to take advantage of that distance, but also there is a way now to easily build conversations around it as well. I mean, if you go to the places like AO3, which is a site for fan fiction, if you go to the places like, I don't know, Tumblr, something like that, there is a lot of meta work, some of it really quite, you know, analytical, going on about these texts by their target readers, especially if you're looking at, say, the young adult readers. They have the advantage of distance in that text, in that, you know, they can read through issues that concern them without being, you know, absolutely traumatized by them, as they might be if it were depicted in a more realistic way. But then they can go and interact with the other people who are also reading those texts. And I think that's something that social media has really allowed them to do, and as speculative, within the speculative genre.
Definitely. And not just for young adults, for adults as well. I mean, I quite often will watch an episode of whatever TV show I'm binging on at the time and then rush to read it to see what other people interpret. Like, well, what do you think about this thing? And that's one of the most fun things about speculative fiction in particular, I think, is because there's so many elements to it, there's lots of different ways you can interpret it or approach it from. And it's always interesting to see what other people are thinking about the things that you're reading or watching.
There's an expectation of community now, I think, within the speculative fiction world. Whether you're looking at Game of Thrones or you know, Star Trek or what have you, because we've had at this point decades and decades, you know, multiple generations of people going to, say, Star Trek conventions and so on. And so there is now that expectation that there will be a group of people who are consuming the same media you are and consuming it in a knowledgeable way. So I think, yeah.
You mean looking at it critically?
Yeah.
So what got you into why speculative for you, Octavia?
Reading as a kid again. The first book I really remember reading was one of the Narnia books, but the one that really hooked me into speculative fiction was Susan Cooper, her Dark is Rising series. Because there was in a couple of the books in that 5-book series really focused on the idea that the good people were doing terrible things to win. And little 8-year-old me could not wrap my head around this, because all the media I'd been consuming up till that point was, you know, good's good, bad's bad, there is a strong separation between them. And Susan Cooper came along and just blew that idea out of the water. And it was a lot to struggle with, and I kept going back and back and back to these books, to The Dark is Rising and The Grey King. And it's something that I think has served me in adult life, that early exposure to boundary crossing.
Right. Did I ask you more about why speculative fiction? Okay, so do you just, Melanie touched on some of the stories that Octavia's just told us what story really spoke to her as a young person. Do the rest of you want to say what story really kind of, cemented speculative fiction in your brain, in your heart, that was the way you were going to go? Did you have anything that really spoke to you when you were starting out? I put you on the spot because this wasn't in the list of questions.
I think Magician was one for me. It was, it was a big, that's such a huge book. But that was a gateway for me, but also all the R.L. Stein.
Goosebumps. Yeah, so fun. I think there's a series coming out.
Yeah, there is.
Anything in particular, Melanie?
The earliest speculative fiction books I can remember reading is Tom Morris's series, and I think that was partly because it was female protagonist, female writer, and I loved the adventure and the world and stuff, and that was something I kept coming back to, like to reread as a comfort read as I got older as well, even as I was moving on to much bigger tools and longer series. So I think that was my gateway.
Anything?
I would say the Douglas Adams series, and I mentioned this in my talk this morning, and I've forgotten the name again. All I can think of is the restaurant at the
Hitchhiker's Guide.
Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Hitchhiker's Guide
Because
to
I
the
write
Galaxy.
about
Iconic,
the
isn't it?
restaurant one, yeah. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, again, it's such a normal world. He's just going to the pub, and then, suddenly he's with a two-headed man in space. And it was also so funny. So I loved that there were these very serious discussions of our relationship with other beings and our relationship with our humanness and other worlds, but it was also hilarious.
Entertaining.
And
I think that's
entertaining,
part of
and
it.
yeah, that's right. So, and I don't know if this is speculative, but I guess apocalyptic.
Good word.
Just go there. The When the Wind Blows comic by David Briggs, which I guess is sort of deeply realist in a way, but sort of has this apocalyptic narrative. When I read that when I was a teenager, an English teacher sort of handed it to me, and it's very much about nuclear apocalypse, but again done in sort of a very domestic, personal way that really just changed my idea of what literature could do, and what images could do.
Yeah, it's interesting how different everyone's experiences are. I think I was raised on grim tales and Aesop's tales, and that fairy stories are speculative, and so I think those sorts of narratives, Maori narratives as well. My parents told me some of the beautiful stories. So probably even younger than teen years. But then when I was in my teenage years, I'm quite a lot older than these ladies, I read The Chrysalid, John Wyndham's The Chrysalid, and that whole sense of otherness and being outside everybody. I was the only Chinese kid in school. It's just, I was different. I got called all the names. And so for me, that whole idea that spoke to me is, being outside the wall, outside of everybody else. So that, and although there was no Asian character in there or anything, and I have never seen, as I said earlier, I've never seen myself in a story. In New Zealand, there's no story about an Asian New Zealand person in an adventure. There isn't. And if I want it, I need to write it myself. But those are the things that kind of spoke to me, and then of course I did all the the Tolkien and all of that stuff, J.M. Barrie, and the stuff that we all raised on, that whole milieu of science fiction, fantasy, I didn't read Heinlein. In fact, I only read that recently, and I nearly lost the will to live.
Yeah, I remember we were
Talking
about and because I'd only read him once too, recently, and I never read him before, and I thought, well, Stranger in a Strange Land is supposed to be famous. I should probably read it. It's one of the classics. And God, it was dire. And so when Lee said on Twitter, I'm reading Highland, it's a bit of a slog. I said, it's not this, is it? And it was.
It was. But just to tell the story, I was on a panel for Con Zealand, and the panel description, which I didn't write, was about based on Heinlein and talking about portrayals of women in speculative fiction going forward. And I was with this absolutely amazing panel. Really, like a little bit of imposter syndrome there. And so I thought, oh gosh, I better read this book and make sure I know what I'm talking about. And I started reading it, and it really has not aged well. I don't know if anyone's read it, but yeah, no, and there's a lot of mansplaining in this particular book, and it was a bit more than I could cope with, so I did have a little whine to Octavia about it. And then I said, you know what, I'm going to talk about other things, and we'll just, and happily the moderator of that particular panel, Catherine Lundoff, is a wonderful writer who publishes, very progressive speculative fiction. She said, you know what? I don't think we'll talk about that. I think we'll move on. This panel is going to be, this is outside the scope of the panel, actually, which was, so that worked very well. Laura, I want to talk to you a little bit about coming. Some of the people might not have come to your talk this morning, so can you talk to us a little bit about that non-human aspect and coming at speculative fiction from that angle?
Yeah, so I guess I've been writing increasingly about animals and about our relationship and lack of relationship with other species, and speculative fiction was a really great way to enter sort of conversations with other animals on the page. In a way, I think that the speculative fiction, and you were sort of touching on this before, Cassie, it's our relationships with other animals. It's hard to sort of imagine ourselves in scenarios with them where we can sort of interact more closely, because often it comes out that the dog gets hurt or the monkey gets experimented on or the fish dies. On the page is a safe space where you can imagine yourself into all sorts of scenarios with other creatures and with other beings in a place that doesn't hurt anybody really, except for when you're talking about representation, but to a limit. So the animals in that country just came from this idea where I was looking at the idea of human exceptionalism and the fact that we hold up language as such a separator between us and other species. We can speak and therefore we are amazing. And I thought, what about if we took that away? Would that change our relationship with animals so much? And instead of making humans silent, I guess I gave or had the animals communicate on the page. So there's a pandemic that, this might be familiar, a pandemic that sweeps through. It's very, very catching. And one of the symptoms, as people who were in the earlier talk heard, is that people can understand what animals are saying with their bodies. And I guess that's where we really launched into that speculative idea, because suddenly there are insects joyously screaming through the air. The birds are doing commentary on the humans below. The whales are breaching and calling out to humans. And it was a very hard novel to write. I was really writing two books in a way, because I don't come from a speculative fiction writing background, even though there's been a few short stories. So I was still writing that realist human story, and I felt that I needed to get that really down pat, but I was also writing this animal communication story, and the hard thing was to bring them together, make them work, which is why it took 7 years.
That's okay.
That's my
Okay. All right. Fair dues. What's it targeted at? What's your audience?
I think it would be, well, people who like reading about animals are going to read it. Like, people like me who just scan the bookshelves for, a dog on the cover or something like that. They're going to read the novel. but I guess it is kind of targeted at literary fiction readers. And I think
So you're going to bring them over to the dark side.
yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's actually a recruitment novel.
Right,
I think that speculative fiction readers would come to it anyway, just because of the topics that the book covers, that interspecies relationship. You know, anyone who is interested in a talking dog or a talking dingo, and also the pandemic element. So yeah, I think I'm just thinking about the publisher. I think they went for the sort of literary fiction with speculative elements model.
So they wanted to move it away from speculative and not claim it, or do you think? Or
I think they felt that, and I think that I felt that, because spec-fit readers are very generous in their reading, and will, you know, if there's
they'll
something that
take it
interests them,
anyway.
they'll take it. We'll take it.
Right, so we'll
Yeah.
pull in the literary
I think
cohort by labelling it this.
Yeah.
That's interesting, isn't
Yeah.
it?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think it's interesting what you're saying, because I think that most of us would be open to that, because let's face it, we've all read The Three Little Pigs, right? And so for children, children are totally accepting of the idea of animals talk. They don't have any problem with it. You tell that story, you read it out, and they're just, they're fine with it. So why is it when we become adults that we, suddenly that's not real? I don't know. My dog always telling me I need to be fed, or can I sit on the sofa? No, it doesn't tell me, it just sits on the sofa. And I think for a lot of people that is their first entry into speculative, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly with animal stories and animals that speak on the page. Some people refuse to take that seriously, but when we look at works like George Orwell's Animal Farm, that was rejected many times for being, a sweet fable.
Yeah, that's sweet fable, right? Planet of the Apes, that kind of notion, that animals are sentient. Yeah.
Well, T.H. White, the Book of Merlin.
Yes, yes. Yeah, exactly. It's interesting because I started with, my second book was a children's book with talking birds. So, and being able to talk to the birds. And so that was, it's a great step in, isn't it, for this is how we bring the children over to the dark side. Yeah. We'll just segue a little bit and ask you sort of, you're new to New Zealand, you're teaching creative writing in a New Zealand context. Let's talk about the difference between New Zealand speculative fiction, as you said, because this is nice to get a different perspective, and Australian, speculative fiction, and in terms of the global as well. What's your view? How are you seeing it?
I mean, I'm still working that out. I think it will be really interesting to see the stories and novels that come out in the next few years, just because things have changed so much. The summer fires loom so large in the Australian landscape and the Australian understanding, but also I was really interested to find how much they seem to affect New Zealand people. The skies were orange here, the mountains were stained by ash, and I suppose the relationship between the two countries is very close. I just think so much has changed in the last year, and that it's almost hard for me to say, what we're responding to now, because as I said before, what we're responding to looms so large now. So it's a terrible answer to your very good question.
No, but it is because you're basically telling us, I don't know because it's so uncertain.
Yeah.
And speculative fiction has to look at uncertainties and what's coming, and that's the whole notion of it, isn't it? So you were saying it's moving too fast. I can't catch it.
It is.
And I think that's probably what a lot of us are feeling. Would you agree, Melanie?
Yeah. I think there's some aspects are moving, and I think there's some commonalities that will remain, and they're probably quite similar between New Zealand and Australian speculative fiction, like the thinking about colonialism and about place, and how important landscape and place is in the story. Like I think we see a lot of that across both New Zealand and Australian speculative fiction. So there's always that what's the next thing and what that we're reacting to, like the fires and the just everything.
Yeah. I mean, certainly when I started writing about talking animals, first of all, I was laughed at. But secondly, there weren't that many other books around that were like that. Kira Dondovie had just brought out a short story collection called Only the Animals, which is all from non-human perspectives.
Sorry, who was that?
Kira Dondovie, she's a short story writer. And Dog Boy by Eva Horner, which really is probably one of my favourite books, about a boy who's adopted by a dog pack in Russia. There were these examples, but in the last 5 years, there has just been so many books written from the perspective of animals, or really, really getting into that idea. And so this animal turn in literature is really happening, and I can see it happening here. I mean, you have a great tradition here with Yamada's The Whale Rider, which is just the foundational, human-animal talking book. And I think it's just published The New Animals, which I'm yet to get to. But
I haven't read it yet either, but I have talked to her about it. Yes,
Yeah.
it's looking exciting, isn't it?
Yeah, so we are seeing this along with the environmental turn, certainly the animal turn, which has been happening since the 70s, but it's really, I think, literary fiction and aspect fiction is really related to that.
And I think you hit on this idea of, opening to new perspectives. And I was talking about new perspectives earlier, but I didn't really cotton on to animal perspectives, and we're giving them a voice. Like what's their, we're responsible for what's happening in the world, largely, global warming and all the rest, and yet they don't get a say. So you're giving this different perspective, you're giving animals a voice, really, and saying putting the, as we do with character, you put yourself in their shoes and say, what are they thinking? So that's, it's interesting that you also laughed at. That seems like bizarre to me, It's just, because it's such an innovative way to look at the world. It really is.
It's nice to be able to abuse people as well sometimes.
Octavia and Cassie, did you want to comment either on that sort of Australia and New Zealand, the difference, or what, or even if anyone wants to talk about specifically what makes New Zealand fiction, speculative fiction, different? It's nice to hear, Laura's point of view, but we're from here, so what makes our fiction different?
I'm not sure. No, I think a lot of what Mel was saying about land and place, but I think that's also very, especially when you've got the Indigenous, New Zealand is Indigenous, like the Aboriginal people in Australia, so you've got those two groups quite often all are unique to other places in the world. So stories from those foundations are part of what makes New Zealand and Australian fiction unique in the world, but I'm not sure how to differentiate, especially after actually having conversations with people at WorldCon and seeing how similar most, many Indigenous cultures' approaches to worldview and setting and the things that are important in the story. So I didn't think until I think there was a Hawaiian lady and
Japanese.
Yeah. So there were a few on a panel from different places, and what I could hear was how similar actually their worldviews were. So it's hard to kind of say what makes a thing unique or different when actually, if you are looking at things in different ways, you can find connections across the globe. So I'm not sure if I could say that there's one thing or two things that make New Zealand speculative fiction or Australian speculative fiction their own unique thing. Maybe that we're at the end of the world.
Yeah, but if you're writing animal pictures, for example, you're not going to get a Kia in, and a Kia has a completely different voice, right, to an American Eagle. It's not the same thing. So, but that's interesting that the parallels. I hadn't noted that.
Really interesting. Yeah, it was quite exciting as Māori author to see that and to hear all the different perspectives and see that commonality between people and hear people say things that they've been laughed at, like they've had an idea and other people are laughing at them about it, and I was like, oh man, I've totally done it too. I wrote a story about that. Oh, oh, that's actually part of my cultural makeup, not just a me being weird thing. So it was really cool. So I don't, other than I think often down here we do have a sense of being at the end of things because of our location in the world, and that isolation is not quite as felt in other parts of the world.
Yeah.
It's that phrase, isn't it? The tyranny of distance. And we talk about it as it applies to us. I believe that it was first applied in the Australian context.
Yeah, I
but
think
it
so.
very quickly became something that we understood. And in some ways, I think it gives us a certain amount of freedom in that we are almost insulated from some of the things that happen around the world. Lee mentioned earlier the chrysalids, which is one of my favourite science fiction books.
Oh,
And
good.
They escape to New Zealand.
Yeah, yeah.
There is this idea, and you see it even now in places around the world, that New Zealand is this isolated island of paradise that you can come to and escape, and when the apocalypse comes, everyone's going to want their bunker in New Zealand. And it treats the country, I think, like as an ideal, not a reality. New Zealand has its own problems, we are not this distant utopian, society. So I think there's that tension between how New Zealand is treated in the wider world and how reality here reflects that. So that's something pretty interesting. I don't know if Australia has the same.
Oh, there's something about what the
experience.
land, I think, does to your psyche, like with even, as a colonized, like a colonizing sort of white person in Australia, I think there is something about even being born on that just huge flat place with these terrifying animals and a culture, that has been there for millennia, the oldest continuous culture in the world. That does something to the way that you write, even though my understanding of that culture is very limited, partly because I am a colonizer and partly because there are some things that I shouldn't access from that land. But that does something, and it fascinates me to see what New Zealand and the culture here does to writers as well. There's got to be something about the shape of the land, the way that the weather is, what cultures exist here.
Water here.
You
there are
must
so
water.
many literary books that talk about drowning in New Zealand.
But I do think, I was talking earlier in my talk about, the fact that it's part of the fabric of our life here. And the fact that New Zealand has this world first in creating the Uraweras as a legal entity in itself, and it's happened again with, I think the rivers.
With the river, we were the first with the river, with the Whanganui. The Colombia and India followed with the Rio Otranto and the Ganges very shortly after, as in weeks after. But yeah, it's something that's spreading throughout the world that I think started here.
But that's come out of Maori narratives of the land and the birds and the trees and what's being part of, the people.
It is. Yeah.
That idea of, of the land as ancestors and the forest as being part of, Maori identity. And so those narratives have been so vital. Those are speculative narratives that have created this legal entity. I just think that is, I was saying earlier, and sorry to the people who were here earlier, but it just blows me away that it's so powerful that it's New Zealand speculative fiction that has led the world in creating this new future where we can protect that piece of land and that beautiful taonga. And I think what an opportunity for speculative fiction. New Zealand speculative fiction is leading the way in that sense. So I love that about it. Go us. But particularly since it's come out of an Indigenous narrative, and as you say, it's spread to, other people are seeing ways that we can use these speculative narratives in order to create a society and a world that we would like to have.
I think it's also a way of creating a resistance too, because I think we have to take into account this what I find ridiculous idea of making corporations.
Yes, and so it's a more, it's a sort of a way
Yeah,
of
I
getting out of doing anything.
Making mountains and rivers legal people does seem so much more rational.
Doesn't
It
it?
is more rational. I mean, it feels less speculative for me. I mean, Tanaki is,
Yes,
he's
totally.
there all the time, and we all say he, and he's, he watches over us, and he's part of our life. So it's less speculative